Chapter 1. The jaws of the abyss were already closing around her. The cold was absolute. It did not merely touch the skin, it fractured the bone. Thick, rusted iron chains dragged her downward, the rough metal biting deeply into her slender wrists. Deeper into the trench. The abyss arena swallowed the little sunlight left in the world, replacing it with a suffocating ink-black void. Water pressed against her ribs like a titan's fist. The pressure was a physical, leaden weight, threatening to crush her lungs into paste. Every beat of her heart felt like a bruising hammer against her sternum. Ondessa did not kick. She did not struggle against the cruel bindings. Her dead, hollow eyes stared straight into the encroaching dark. She was a stone sinking into a forgotten grave, tasting nothing but bitter salt and the metallic tang of her own bleeding lip. Below her, the silt stirred. A colossal shadow uncoiled from the depths of the arena floor. A deep-sea terror born of nightmares and ancient blood. Rows of razor-sharp teeth gleamed in the faint, ghostly bioluminescent glow of the trench walls. Its eyes were milky white, blind but ravenously hungry. It surged upward. The current violently ripped around its imposing form, creating a vortex of chilling water. Death approached with a gaping maw, ready to tear her fragile body into ribbons. Ondessa simply watched it come. A flicker of a smirk touched her pale, bloodless lips. She did not attempt to swim away. She merely raised a single, heavily bound hand. Her thumb pressed firmly against her middle finger. She snapped. No sound echoed in the watery expanse. But the ocean itself seemed to tear open. A silent, violent shockwave erupted from her fragile frame. The invisible acoustic blast slammed directly into the charging Leviathan. The beast froze in mid-lunge, its towering body convulsed uncontrollably. It let out a pathetic gurgling whine that sent panicked bubbles racing toward the surface. Slowly, painfully, the apex predator sank into the muck. It bowed its grotesque head, pressing its snout firmly into the mud at her chained feet in absolute submission. Ondessa lowered her hand. Her fingers trembled wildly. They burned me for this, she thought, the phantom heat of the surface world blistering across her memory. Now the ocean kneels. Even in the freezing depths, she could smell the dry pine wood. She could feel the scorching, unforgiving flames licking at her bare ankles, peeling the skin from her flesh. The frenzied chants of the humans still rang in her fractured mind. Sea demon, burn the witch. The memories tasted of copper and ruin. She remembered the suffocating, vile burn of tar-soaked rags shoved brutally down her throat to drown out her agonizing screams. They had tried to break her. They had tried to silence her. Now that forced silence was her absolute armor. Her voice was a weapon she refused to wield for a world that hated her. She would never speak again. She would rather let the entire ocean rot around her. High above the arena floor, a true predator watched. Zeroth sat perfectly still upon his throne of twisted black coral. His piercing golden eyes locked onto the frail, chained creature in the mud. He was the Leviathan King, the absolute ruler of the crushing dark. His pheromones bled into the shifting currents, a potent, dizzying scent of churning storms and ozone that demanded submission from all who breathed it. He had come to his balcony to watch a routine execution, a rogue surface dweller thrown to the beasts for his amusement. Instead, he witnessed a godless miracle. Then, it hit him. A violent tearing pull erupted in the dead center of his chest. His heart hammered aggressively against his ribs, a frantic primal rhythm that stole the breath straight from his lungs. The mate bond. It did not gently weave into his soul. It struck, like lightning splitting the sea. It demanded. It roared. The untamed beast beneath his skin clawed viciously at his sanity, howling for the broken siren in the dirt. Every instinct in his ancient blood screamed at him to claim, to protect, to slaughter anything that dared look at her. His grip tightened. The solid coral armrest of his throne shattered into jagged dust. "That is not a woman," Zirath murmured. His voice was a lethal vibrating rumble that shook the water around him. "That is a catastrophe." He did not hesitate. The king of the deep stepped off his dais into the open water. He plummeted. The ocean parted for him, bending to his absolute terrifying will. The water boiled around his descending form. He struck the arena floor like a falling star. The brutal impact sent a shockwave of mud and debris blasting outward, forcing the cowering beast to flee into the shadowy crevices of the trench. Zirath stood tall, a towering monolith of dark armor, raw power, and lethal grace. He stepped directly into Ondessa's personal space, entirely blocking her view of the abyss. His imposing frame became an inescapable cage. He looked down into her defiant, hollow eyes. The scent of her hit him full force, sea salt mixed with an underlying tragic tang of old ash. It made his fangs ache with the desperate need to bite, to mark, to keep. He turned his head slightly toward the observing darkness of the stands. His voice boomed, carrying across the silent expanse of his underwater kingdom with a promise of bloodshed. "This creature is my prisoner," Zirath declared, the absolute authority in his tone vibrating against her skin, "and your queen." Chapter 2. The chamber was a gilded cage. Smooth, iridescent black pearl lined the circular walls, offering no corners to hide in and no exit to exploit. The royal grotto was designed for luxury, yet the air felt impossibly thin. Ondessa pressed her spine flat against the curved wall. The chill of the pearl seeped through her thin, tattered garments, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating heat radiating from the man stalking toward her. Zirath moved with the terrifying, unhurried grace of an apex predator, cornering its prey. Every step he took swallowed the distance between them. The sheer size of him blotted out the glowing, luminescent moss clinging to the ceiling. His pheromones crashed into her like a physical wave. It was an overwhelming, intoxicating scent of churning storms, crushed sea salt, and raw, feral dominance. It coated the back of her throat. It made her pulse hammer an erratic, frightened rhythm against her collarbone. She squeezed her eyes shut. She refused to look at him. She refused to acknowledge the heavy, vibrating hum of his presence that inexplicably settled the frantic trembling in her hands. Zirath stopped mere inches away. The water between them grew agonizingly hot. He did not touch her, but his proximity was a violation of her rigid boundaries. He leaned in, bracing one heavily scarred arm against the pearl wall beside her head, effectively trapping her in his shadow. "Look at me," he ordered. The command was a low, vibrating purr that resonated deep within her chest. It was not a request. Ondessa kept her eyes tightly closed. She turned her face away, exposing the delicate line of her throat. It was an act of defiance, not submission. Her jaw clamped shut, locking away the screams she had buried years ago. Zirath let out a ragged breath. The defiance maddened him, yet it drew him in like a moth to an open flame. The mate bond clawed viciously at his chest, demanding he taste her skin, demanding he prove to his beast that she was real and unharmed. He leaned closer. His face hovered over the crook of her neck. He inhaled deeply, drawing in the scent of her fear and the lingering tragic ghost of wood smoke. His hand moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion. He wanted to soothe the erratic beating of her pulse. His knuckles grazed her collarbone, trailing upward, then his skin brushed against the puckered, ruined flesh on the side of her neck, the burn scar. The reaction was instantaneous. Ondessa's eyes flew open. They were not hollow anymore. They were wide with pure, blinding terror. The gentle touch did not ground her. It threw her back into the flames. The pearl walls vanished. The smell of the ocean evaporated. Suddenly, she was tied to the wooden stake. The heat of the fire licked greedily at her legs. The mob was screaming. The executioner was forcing the thick, tar-soaked rag into her mouth, silencing her pleas, stealing her air, burning her throat from the inside out. "Don't touch me." Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized her body. Survival instinct overrode her conscious mind. She did not see a king. She saw the enemy. With a feral, soundless snarl, Ondessa lunged. She opened her mouth and sank her teeth directly into the side of Zirath's neck, right where the soft flesh met his gill slits. She bit down hard. A sharp hiss ripped from Zirath's throat. Radiant, glowing green blood immediately welled up around her teeth, staining her pale chin. The metallic, otherworldly taste flooded her mouth. She tasted power. She tasted his life force. She waited for the inevitable blow. She braced for the fist that would shatter her jaw, for the cruelty she had come to expect from every living creature. The blow never came. Instead, Zirath froze. His powerful muscles locked entirely. He didn't pry her off. He didn't strike her down. Gently, with agonizing restraint, he stepped back, breaking the physical connection. Glowing emerald blood trailed down his heavily muscled chest. He pressed a hand to the wound, his golden eyes wide, staring at her trembling, defensive form. The feral rage he possessed vanished, replaced by a sudden, devastating fracture in his composure. He looked at the blood on his fingers, then back to her terrified face. His broad chest heaved as he struggled to contain the beast roaring in agony inside him. "That look," Zirath rasped, his voice breaking. The absolute authority was gone, leaving only a raw, bleeding wound. He backed away another step, putting distance between them. "You look at me as if I am the scum that burned you." Ondessa stumbled back against the wall, her chest heaving, the taste of his blood a stark reminder of her own monstrous reaction. She saw the profound, unmasked hurt in the Leviathan King's eyes. For a split second, the impenetrable wall around her shattered heart cracked. Before she could process the fracture, the water in the chamber violently shuddered. A sickening crack echoed through the grotto. The impenetrable ward sealing the royal chamber shattered like fragile glass. The ambient blue light of the moss instantly died, swallowed by a creeping, unnatural darkness. From the fractured entrance, a shadow materialized. Morkan. The manipulator of the deep wore a twisted, mocking grin. He didn't waste a second. He raised his hand and released a swirling cloud of pitch-black powder into the currents. Abyss ash. The toxic dust spread with unnatural speed. Ondessa gasped in shock as the black cloud hit her. It rushed into her nose and mouth. Instantly, her throat ignited in pure, excruciating agony. It felt as if molten lead had been poured directly onto her vocal cords. She choked. Thick black blood sprayed from her lips as she doubled over. The silence she had weaponized was suddenly weaponized against her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't scream. The strength bled from her limbs in a rush of terrifying numbness. Her vision tunneled. The pearl walls spun wildly. Ondessa collapsed, slipping over the edge of the royal balcony and falling freely into the bottomless trench below. Above her, the ocean tore itself apart. Zirath let out a roar that ruptured the water pressure for miles. The sound was not a scream. It was an apocalypse. His golden eyes flared with a murderous, blinding light. The regal king vanished. In his place, a half-shifted monstrosity of scales, jagged spines, and ancient fury erupted from the balcony, diving straight into the abyss after the fading shadow of his mate. Chapter 3. The water tore violently. Zeroth crashed through the heavy sea-glass doors of his inner sanctum. He did not swim. He moved like a ballistic missile. Ondessa was a limp, terrifyingly fragile weight in his arms. Black, tar-like ash leaked from her parted lips. The toxic substance hissed maliciously as it hit the marble floor. It dissolved the ancient stone instantly. "Get out of my way," Zeroth roared. The sheer force of the command shattered a nearby crystal pillar. Tritch practically rolled into the room. The royal advisor took one look at the melting stone and utterly panicked. In a heartbeat, the half-shark, half-pufferfish creature inflated into a colossal spiky sphere. He bounced frantically against the high ceiling. "By the crushing depths, you brought a time bomb into the palace," Tritch wailed. His tiny fins flapped uselessly against his bloated sides. "Her blood is eating the foundation. Sire, she will melt the entire royal wing." Zeroth completely ignored him. He laid Ondessa down on the sprawling bed of woven kelp and black silk. Her skin was a sickly ash-gray. Her chest barely moved. The abyss ash was suffocating her from the inside out, crystallizing her delicate lungs into brittle stone. Zeroth placed both his large calloused hands heavily over her ribcage. He channeled his raw, tempestuous magic. The water around them grew boiling hot. The sharp, electric scent of ozone and deep sea salt flooded the bedchamber. He forced his pure energy into her chest, trying to violently flush the poison out of her system. Ondessa suddenly arched her spine. She thrashed wildly on the bed. Her eyes were tightly squeezed shut in absolute mind-breaking agony. Tears, dark and tainted with the vile ash, spilled down her pale cheeks. Her lips moved frantically. No sound escaped her ruined throat. Yet the mate bond transmitted her raw, unfiltered terror directly into Zeroth's skull. "Don't burn. Please, don't burn me." The psychic echo ripped Zeroth's heart in two. The phantom smell of scorched flesh invaded his own senses. He leaned directly over her, his fierce features twisting with a helpless, devastating, protective rage. "I have you. There is no fire here," he whispered fiercely, pressing his forehead against hers. "I will not let you burn." As he pushed deeper into her core, his magic collided with something impossible. It was not just the weak, fading soul of a ruined siren. Beneath the suffocating poison, a dormant, terrifying power violently pulsed. It tasted of the very creation of the oceanic trenches. It was ancient, devastating, and entirely unstable. Zeroth froze. The realization hit him like a physical, leaden blow to the gut. She was not a mere abyss dweller. She was the final vessel of the primordial line. The forgotten legends were true. She was a walking apocalypse. If her full power ever detonated, the sheer acoustic force would wipe the Leviathan race from existence. Keeping her was suicide for his entire kingdom. Letting her die, however, would permanently sever the mate bond. The resulting psychological and physical trauma would slowly, agonizingly kill him. He looked down at her pale, tear-stained face. He watched a single drop of black blood slide from her chin. He didn't care if she destroyed his kingdom. He would gladly build a new empire over the ashes. "Tritch, seal the heavy doors," Zeroth ordered. His lethal voice left zero room for negotiation. "No one enters this wing. Execute anyone who tries," the pufferfish squeaked in sheer terror, slowly deflating, "Sire, you cannot possibly mean—" "Elid!" Zirath lifted his right arm. He extended a single razor-sharp claw from his left hand. Without a microsecond of hesitation, he slashed deeply across his own wrist. The scent of royal Leviathan blood filled the suffocating room. It was intoxicating, spicy, and vibrating with pure ancient magic. Emerald liquid welled up instantly, glowing brilliantly in the dim light of the grotto. He hovered over Ondessa's thrashing form. He gently pried her clamped jaw open with his thumb. "Drink," he commanded softly. He pressed his bleeding wrist firmly against her mouth. The thick, glowing blood dripped past her cracked lips. Royal blood was the ultimate purifier. It was the only known antidote potent enough to dissolve abyss ash. Ondessa choked at first. Her battered body instinctively rejected the sudden intrusion. But the potent life-giving heat of his essence forced its way down her ravaged throat. The creeping black veins crawling up her neck immediately began to recede. The horrific hissing of the toxic poison faded into silence. Her breathing, previously a shallow, dying rattle, slowly deepened. Zirath did not pull his arm away. He let her drink deeply, willing his own life force to knit her fractured insides back together. Then, the air in the room fundamentally changed. The temperature violently spiked. It was not the biting heat of the surface fire. It was a suffocating, dense biological heat. The direct introduction of apex predator blood into a primordial vessel triggered a brutal, unstoppable chain reaction. The marine heat phase, a feral, instinctual drive to bond, to survive, to violently reproduce. Ondessa's body went completely rigid. A low, vibrating hum emanated from her chest, vibrating against the mattress. Zirath finally pulled his wrist back. His golden eyes widened in sudden, stark realization of what his cure had just accidentally triggered. Ondessa's eyes snapped open. The hollow, dead emptiness was entirely gone. Her irises blazed with a brilliant predatory gold. The scent of her shifted instantly. The tragic smell of old ash vanished entirely. It was replaced by an overwhelmingly sweet, intoxicating aroma of night-blooming sea lotus and raw, unfiltered desire. It was a scent designed to drive males to slaughter one another. Before Zirath could step back to give her space, she moved with terrifying speed. Her hands shot up, her fingers, no longer trembling with fear, dug viciously into the bare, muscular expanse of his chest. Her sharp nails scored deep, bloody lines into his flesh. She didn't flinch at the sight of his emerald blood. She grabbed the heavy collar of his armor and yanked him downward with a supernatural strength that rivaled his own. She dragged him until his face was mere inches from hers. Her golden eyes locked onto his, burning with a frantic, desperate hunger that bordered on sheer madness. Her chest heaved heavily against his. Her lips parted. She still could not use her voice, but she forced a raspy, breathless sound from her healing, desperately aching throat. "Don't go." Chapter 4. The fever consumed her entirely. It was not a fire of destruction, but a deeply biological inferno, the primal urge to mate, to bond, to survive the lingering poison, hijacked her shattered nervous system. She clawed at his chest armor. She needed skin. She needed to anchor herself to the apex predator before her sanity slipped into the void. The sweet, maddening scent of sea lotus bled heavily from her pores, saturating the water. Zirath's control fractured. His beast roared, thrashing against its cage, screaming at him to claim his mate, to sink his teeth into her claiming mark, to fill the aching emptiness she was projecting through the bond. Her golden eyes begged him. Her nails tore through the fabric of his undershirt, drawing fresh, glowing green blood. She dragged her body upward, pressing her feverish curves against the hard lines of his torso. The contact sent a lethal jolt of electricity straight to his core. Every male instinct ordered him to take her. The royal blood in her veins practically demanded a permanent physical union. But he looked down at her frantic, unfocused eyes. He saw the sheer desperation born from trauma and poison, not pure, unclouded consent. She was drowning in an instinctual haze. He would not be another monster taking what she could not freely give. Zirath clamped his jaw shut. His fangs ached with the agonizing effort to pull back. He gently caught her flailing wrists, halting her frantic assault. "No," he rumbled. The deep vibration resonated directly through her chest, soothing her frantic heartbeat. "Not like this. Not when you are broken." Ondessa let out a soundless, frustrated whine. She bucked against his grip, her golden eyes flashing with feral annoyance. She needed the pain to stop. She needed him. Zirath released her hands. He stepped back just enough to summon his magic. The water around them instantly hardened. Liquid titanium chains manifested from the currents, swirling with terrifying speed. He did not aim them at her. Instead, he wrapped the magical bindings aggressively around his own wrists. He locked his hands firmly behind his broad back, sealing the chains with a complex pulse of magic. He stripped away his remaining armor with a violent shrug of his shoulders. He left his upper body completely bare, completely vulnerable. He lay down beside her on the kelp bed. He offered no restraint, only his overwhelming, radiant body heat. Ondessa threw herself at him immediately. Driven by feral frustration and chemical imbalance, she bit down hard on his shoulder. She clawed deep, vicious tracks down his muscular chest. She punished him for denying her the release her body demanded. Zirath did not flinch. He did not pull away. He simply absorbed her pain. His golden eyes glowed with a fierce, unwavering devotion in the dim light of the grotto. He shifted his body to provide maximum warmth, shielding her from the ambient chill of the room. He let her tear at his flesh. He let her bleed the poison and the panic out through physical exhaustion. He endured the torturous proximity of his mate in heat, bound by his own uncompromising will, until the fever finally broke. Exhaustion ultimately dragged her into a deep, dreamless sleep. The ambient light in the chamber slowly shifted to a soft dawn blue. Ondessa blinked awake. The frantic burning in her veins was gone. Her throat felt raw, completely scraped hollow, but the agonizing tightness of the ash had vanished. She breathed in. Deep, full breaths of clean, salty water filled her healing lungs. She slowly turned her head against the silk pillows. Zirath sat slumped against the headboard. His hands were still bound tightly behind him by the water chains. His broad chest and sculpted shoulders were a brutal canvas of violent, bloody scratches and deep bite marks. Her doing. Glowing emerald blood had dried over the wounds, yet his head was bowed in exhausted slumber. He stood guard over her like a loyal, battered hound. A profound tremor shook her soul. The impenetrable iron walls around her heart violently collapsed. She stared at the Leviathan King. He was a being capable of crushing underwater cities with a mere thought. He could have taken her. He could have forced a bond that her body was already begging for. Yet he had physically chained himself to keep her safe from his own feral instincts. He was not a tyrant. He was not the humans who had burned her. He was her absolute shield. Slowly, her trembling hand reached out. Her fingertips gently brushed the worst of the jagged gashes on his shoulder. Zirath stirred instantly. His golden eyes snapped open, instantly alert, instantly scanning the room for threats. When his gaze landed on her, The lethal edge melted away. He looked at her small hand resting on his ruined shoulder. He did not speak. He merely waited, letting her set the pace. Ondessa looked deep into his eyes. The hollow emptiness of her past was gone. For the first time in a century, she felt an overwhelming, terrifying warmth blooming in her chest. Before she could process the emotion, the heavy sea glass doors slammed open with a deafening crash. Tritch launched himself into the room. The pufferfish was fully inflated, bouncing off the doorframe. His poisonous spines jutted out in every direction, quivering with panic. His round eyes were wide with sheer terror. "Sire!" Tritch shrieked, his voice cracking violently. He spun in the water, pointing a tiny fin toward the exit. "Morkan tore the abyss rift. He breached the nursery. He has the siren children in the coral ridge. He took them hostage." Chapter 5. The news struck like a physical blow. The fragile intimacy of the dawn instantly shattered. Ondessa did not hesitate. The lingering warmth of the heat phase evaporated from her blood, replaced by a sudden, glacial focus. She slid off the kelp bed. Her bare feet touched the ruined marble floor. The water around her plummeted in temperature, chilling the room. She was no longer a victim hiding from the flames. She was the final vessel of the primordial line. Zeroth reacted instantly. With a sharp, violent flex of his broad shoulders, he shattered his liquid titanium chains. The metallic bindings exploded into harmless bubbles. He stepped forward, his towering frame imposing, ready to command his armies. Ondessa stopped him. She placed her cold hand flat against his scarred chest. She pushed. It was not a physical match of strength, but the intent behind the gesture was absolute. She looked up into his golden eyes. The frantic vulnerability was gone, replaced by a devastating resolve. She pointed to her own chest. Then she opened her hands violently outward. "I am a weapon. I destroy." She pointed firmly at him, then to the floor of the sanctum. "Stay here." She knew the truth. If she went to the abyss rift and unleashed her voice to save those children, she would obliterate everything in her path. She would kill the villain, but she would also kill the king who had bled for her. She refused to be the reason his kingdom fell. Ondessa turned and swam out of the royal grotto, moving with terrifying silent speed. She breached the grand thoroughfare of the palace. The sheer scale of the Leviathan military was awe-inspiring. Thousands of elite guards were already assembling in perfect formation. Forged deep iron spears gleamed under the bioluminescent lights. The water hummed with the sharp electric tension of impending war. Zeroth caught her dead in the center of the armada. He did not shout. He simply caught her wrist. He did not grip her to cause pain, but to anchor her to reality. The entire royal guard went completely still. Thousands of lethal warriors watched their absolute monarch step in front of the mute, frail siren. "You think you can leave me behind," Zeroth murmured. His voice was not a roar, but a low, lethal vibration that resonated through the floorboards. Ondessa glared at him. She tried to yank her arm away. She needed him to understand the danger she posed. She was a walking apocalypse. Zeroth did not let go. Instead, he did the unthinkable. The imposing king of the deep, the ruthless apex predator who bowed to no god, sank downward. Slowly, deliberately, Zeroth dropped to one knee against the polished obsidian floor. The sheer impact of the gesture sent a shock wave of disbelief through the ranks of soldiers. A collective stunned silence swallowed the grand hall. He looked up at her from the floor. He pulled her trembling hand forward and pressed her palm directly against the most vulnerable point of his throat, right over his beating pulse. "If you are a monster," Zirath declared, his voice carried a devastating, unwavering devotion, "then I will gladly drown for you." He held her hand tighter against his skin. "Take my voice, take my life, just do not disappear." The oxygen left Ondessa's lungs. The invisible walls guarding her soul completely dissolved into the currents. A single, profound tear escaped her eye. The moment the salty drop touched the freezing water, it crystallized. It hardened instantly into a flawless, shimmering black pearl. It drifted slowly downward, striking his armored knee with a soft clink. Ondessa sank to her knees to meet him. She framed his rugged, scarred face with both hands. She closed her eyes and pressed her lips fiercely against his. It was not a gentle, hesitant, human kiss. It was a desperate, crushing collision of souls. She poured every ounce of her unspoken grief, her raw gratitude, and her absolute loyalty into that single connection under the crushing pressure of the sea. When they finally broke apart, the king stood. He pulled his queen up beside him. Zirath drew his colossal broadsword, the dark metal humming with tempestuous magic. He looked at his army. "We march for the rift," he commanded. "Leave nothing alive." The journey to the outer edge of the kingdom was brutally fast. The coral ridge was a graveyard of jagged, bleached reefs hovering over a bottomless trench. The abyss rift pulsed with a sickening, toxic purple light. Morkan stood at the edge of the chasm. Behind him, dozens of tiny, terrified siren children were trapped inside cages woven from dark, suffocating magic. The manipulator laughed as the Leviathan vanguard arrived. He held a massive urn of raw abyss ash. "You are too late, your majesty," Morkan shrieked, his voice echoing with manic glee. "The trench belongs to the dead." He slammed his hands against the rocky sea floor. Dark necromancy flooded the water. The silt violently erupted. Hundreds of rotting, ancient deep-sea corpses tore themselves from the mud. The undead horde possessed glowing crimson eyes and razor-sharp claws dripping with venom. "Slaughter them," Morkan ordered, pointing a skeletal finger directly at Zirath and his guards. The horde surged forward. But then they abruptly stopped. A chilling, unnatural silence fell over the battlefield. The rotting corpses did not attack the Leviathan army. Instead, they slowly turned their horrifying faces toward the center of the royal vanguard. They looked past the imposing king. They looked directly at Ondessa. Morkan's twisted smile vanished. "What are you doing? Kill them." The dead ignored him. With sickening, synchronized cracks of decaying joints, the entire undead army sank to their knees in the silt. They bowed their heads, pressing their foreheads into the mud. They were not submitting to a necromancer. They were worshipping the primordial vessel. Ondessa floated upward, hovering slightly above the ocean floor. The golden light in her eyes violently snapped out. Her irises were swallowed entirely by an abyssal, terrifying black. Chapter 6. Morkan's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. His grand ritual was a catastrophic failure. The dead did not serve him. They worshipped the very creature he sought to destroy. The necromancer's eyes darted frantically between the kneeling corpses and the approaching Leviathan army. "If I cannot rule this trench, I will turn it to dust," Morkan shrieked. He raised the massive urn of pure abyss ash high above his head and violently shattered it against the jagged reef. He channeled every ounce of his dark, twisting magic into the powder. A catastrophic shockwave erupted. It was not a mere cloud. It was a towering tidal wave of pitch-black death. The toxic tsunami screamed across the ocean floor, rushing directly toward the trapped siren children and the vanguard of the royal army. Zirath did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He lunged ahead of his soldiers. A blinding atomic flash of emerald light consumed him. The regal king vanished into a violently shifting maelstrom of ancient magic and raw muscle. He erupted from the light in his true, primordial form, a colossal, armored sea dragon born of nightmares and churning storms. His spine was lined with jagged, razor-sharp obsidian plates. He coiled his titanic body directly in the path of the toxic tsunami, becoming a living, impenetrable shield for his kingdom. The black wave collided with Zirath's scales. The impact rang out like a shattered cathedral bell. Toxic magic violently hissed, eating away at his indestructible armor with agonizing speed. Zirath roared. The sound ruptured the sea floor, sending deep fissures spiderwebbing through the rock. Suddenly, a spherical, spiky blur shot past his enormous jaw. "Eat venom, you rotting sea slug!" Tritch screamed. The royal advisor was fully inflated, his tiny fins flapping wildly as he rolled directly over the battlefield. He violently expelled a concentrated cloud of lethal, paralyzing neurotoxin directly into Morkan's exposed flank. The necromancer choked, his casting arm locking up instantly. But Morkan was a creature of desperate malice. With his remaining hand, he condensed the swirling abyss ash into a single, jagged spear of pure, solidified oblivion. He hurled it with terrifying velocity. The dark spear bypassed Zirath's dissolving armor. It drove deep into the soft, glowing flesh of the Leviathan's chest. Zirath let out a broken, deafening sound. The towering beast faltered. His colossal form shrank, violently shifting back into his humanoid shape. He crashed against the coral floor, emerald blood pooling rapidly around him. The imposing king of the deep gasped, his golden eyes dimming as the lethal poison flooded his veins. Ondessa stopped breathing. The world around her plunged into absolute, terrifying silence. She hovered above the battlefield, staring at the man bleeding out in the silt, the man who had chained himself to protect her, the man who had offered his throat to her wrath, her shield, her mate. The memory of the flames, the paralyzing fear of the human mob, the century of self-imposed muteness, it all burned away. It was replaced by a blinding, incandescent rage. Ondessa threw her head back. She opened her mouth. For the first time in 100 years, she released her voice. She unleashed the death song. It was not a scream. It was a flawless, devastatingly beautiful melody that commanded the very fabric of the ocean. The sonic wave exploded outward in a blinding ring of white-hot acoustic force. It struck Morkan first. The villain did not even have time to register his own demise. The frequency violently vibrated his molecular structure until he simply disintegrated, turning into harmless, drifting sea snow. The song washed over the battlefield. The acoustic magic obliterated the toxic black ash, instantly purifying the trench into crystal-clear water. The cages holding the siren children shattered into glowing dust. Then the melody wrapped around Zirath. The song shifted. It was no longer a weapon of destruction. It became a frantic, beautiful lullaby woven with ancient restorative power. The frequency resonated with his royal blood. The jagged, lethal wound in his chest violently stitched itself closed. His breathing hitched. He gasped, pulling in a deep, desperate lungful of clean water. Ondessa slowly descended, her feet touching the soft sand. The black void in her eyes faded, returning to their natural, striking depth. She collapsed to her knees beside him, her trembling hands resting flat against his rapidly beating heart. Zirath reached up. His calloused fingers brushed a stray lock of hair from her pale face. He did not speak. He did not need to. The mate bond hummed between them, singing a song of absolute, unbreakable devotion. The aftermath was a profound, reverent silence. The water in the royal bedchamber was blissfully warm. The scent of churning storms and sweet sea lotus mingled perfectly in the dim, bioluminescent light of the black pearls. The war was over. The children were safe. The entire ocean had bowed to the primordial vessel. Ondessa sat near the edge of the sprawling kelp bed. She wore a sheer, shimmering gown of spun silver, the delicate fabric floating beautifully around her legs. Her posture radiated absolute, supreme authority. Her expression remained her signature, beautiful, glacial mask. She was the undisputed queen of the abyss. Yet her dark eyes softened entirely as she looked down. Zirath, the brutal, terrifying ruler of the dark, did not sit beside her. He knelt on the polished obsidian floor. His broad, heavily scarred chest was bare, a physical testament to the violence he had endured to keep her safe. He moved with slow, deliberate grace. He carefully lifted her bare foot, cradling her heel in his large, powerful hand. He bowed his head, his dark hair cascading over his broad shoulders, and pressed a tender, devastatingly reverent kiss directly to her ankle. His lips lingered against her skin. The touch sent a slow, intoxicating shiver up her spine. Ondessa reached out, her fingers gently tangled in his dark hair, offering a silent, deeply intimate permission. Zirath looked up, his golden eyes locked onto hers, burning with an obsessive, feral devotion that would outlast the stars. He was the apex predator of the deep. He owned the crushing depths and commanded an army of nightmares. But in the quiet sanctity of their chamber, the Leviathan King was entirely, willingly trapped. He was her absolute prisoner, and he would never let her go.